Hello, everyone. So welcome, everybody, to this LSE Ideas event on the US presidential elections and US-China relations. My name is Gidon Gautel. I'm the project coordinator for the LSE Ideas China Foresight project, and I think we're set for an exciting evening. This is China Foresight's first event of the academic year on the night of the final presidential debates in a historic presidential election. And I'm particularly excited to be able to introduce a stellar panel to discuss this topic tonight. We've got Professor Michael Cox, who's a founding director of LSE Ideas, an emeritus professor in international relations at LSE, and senior academic advisor to the China Foresight Project at Ideas. We've got Professor Matthew Kroenig, who's a professor in the Department of Government and Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. And he was recently ranked as one of the top 25 most cited political scientists of his generation. Dr. Evan Medeiros is the Penner Family Chair in Asia Studies in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He previously served for 6 years on the staff of the White House's National Security Council as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia, and then as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia from 2009 until 2015. And finally, Dr. Yu Jie is an Associate of LSE Ideas and former head of the China Foresight Project, as well as a Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. And her and Professor Cox have also taught together on the LSE PKU Summer School. So major election models are currently giving Joe Biden a roughly 90% probability of winning the presidential contest. However, given the stakes of this election, a 1 in 10 chance of re-election for President Trump warrants attention. And with partisan voting behavior and record projected turnouts, this is still an uncertain election. So whatever side of the aisle you fall on, you should get comfortable with the world if the other party wins the presidency. And this is what we're going to be doing tonight. So we're going to run through the possible futures facing us. Professor Cox will set the scene. Professor Kroenig will delve into what we've learned from the Trump administration and what we could expect from another 4-year term. Dr. Medeiros will explore Team Biden's likely approach to China. And Dr. Yu Jie will give us the view from Beijing to determine how these dynamics will play out. So finally, if you're tweeting tonight, then please use the hashtag LSEUSChina. If you think of any questions during the panel, please submit them via the Q&A function. And please note that the event is to be recorded to be made into a podcast. So the stakes couldn't be higher. So with no further ado, Mick, if you could tell us, how did we get here? And how much can we expect this election to realistically change US-China relations?
Okay, well, first, thank you, Gidon, for that very, very nice introduction. And it's wonderful to welcome our colleagues from across the Atlantic in Georgetown, and wonderful to be with you, G, again. We had wonderful times in Beijing teaching, so it's fantastic. I'm going to say a little less about the election. I'll leave that for pundits and experts to get right or to get wrong. Everybody knows it's an extraordinary moment in American electoral history, and by definition, what happens in America impacts on the rest of the world. I thought I'd pull back a bit, though, Gideon, if I might, and maybe make the argument that if we focus less on the election for the moment and focus on what I think more generally has been happening in the US-China relationship, we may get a bigger picture and a better perspective of where things will go, whoever gets elected, in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I suppose my message is, and it may be a rather pessimistic one, that I think there's been something of a deep sea change in the United States, across the parties and across many, many parts of the think tank world, about the relationship with China more generally. This is not only applying to the United States, but that's what I'm going to focus in on. So I think my message is a somewhat pessimistic one. I wish I could be more upbeat about where I think things might go after November, whoever gets elected. But I'll explain why I have a certain downbeat perspective. This, by the way, contrasts very much. When Yu Jie and I were teaching in Beidar over 10 years ago, there was a greater optimism about that relationship, a belief in that partnership. Although there were rivalry aspects, there was a partnership kind of underlying philosophy. And I think that is what has gone. Whether it's gone forever, never say nothing forever, but that's what I want to say. The first thing I think I want to make the point and drive it home. If one goes back to the origins of the relationship between the US and China, going back to the Nixon grand moment or the Kissinger grand moment, go through the Carter years, the leader of China visiting the United States, recognition, move it through the Reagan years, the Bush years, move it through the crisis of Tiananmen, which was overcome by Bush Senior, go through the Clinton years, go through even the early G.W. Bush years, and maybe even go into the first term of President Obama, who we saw speaking last night in the US. There was a kind of sense that whatever the differences between systems, and they're obvious, whatever the differences between philosophies and outlooks, cultures and histories, even though there was an element always bound to be of competition and rivalry, there was nonetheless underlying it a certain sense on the American side, I think, and across political parties. After all, the new relationship was established by a Republican, namely Nixon, and carried forward too by Ronald Reagan and then by George Bush Senior. But somehow or another you could, by working with, trading with, investing in, incorporate China into the international order. There was a process of engagement which would socialize China. There was a phrase used by Bob Zoellick, who's not party political, but he used the term making China a stakeholder. President Clinton made the point that if we could trade with China, invest in China, they will become like us, not exactly politically, but they will get a stake in the system. Liberal international relations theorists like John Eikenberry, my very good friend from Princeton, made exactly the same point. Bring China in, incorporate it into the liberal order. It'll be impossible for it to then depart or challenge the liberal order. Now, that I think was the situation maybe to the last 2 or 3 years of the Obama administration, but it's certainly not been the position of Trump. And I think that's where the deep sea change is now taking place. I think there is now a rejection of that previous strategy, that the strategy of engagement was misdirected. You hear that all the time now, I think. It was naive to think China could become a stakeholder. And the net result, and I've heard this from some very good friends in the States who are not Trump supporters, but the net result of working with China, investing in China, in some ways making China a partner, was actually to make the enemy stronger. And I've heard that said time and again. By the way, if you want to read books, and I'm reading quite a lot at the moment, and I've just read H.R. McMaster's book, Battlegrounds, former NSC advisor, also John Bolton's book, The Room Where It Happened. Both of those make all those points together. And although both in the end got sacked from the Trump administration, they both make the same point about the naivete of previous administrations, whether Republican or Democrat. So I think there is something really big going on there. And the second point I want to make is about public opinion. Now, I don't believe that public opinion drives foreign policy. I think interests do. But I do think public opinion matters a great deal. And I know Cherry knows a lot about this as well. And I'd be very interested to hear what our American colleagues have to say. But if one looks at the Pew, and I always take the Pew almost as gospel on much of this, by the way, nonetheless, what the Pew results show us is quite clear that we are now at a most unfavorable moment in terms of outside Western perceptions and American perceptions of China. And that will affect the way either candidate or both candidates, including Biden, will look at China after November. And actually, there's been an extraordinary deterioration in that perception of President Xi Jinping himself. In 2019, the people in America who said they had no confidence in President Xi Jinping to do the right thing regarding world affairs, in 2019 stood at 50%. 2020, it stands at 77%. And by the way, it's not just America. You know, you've got to look across the world. There's been an overall decline in positive perceptions towards more negative towards China. And again, that's going to affect it. Now, we know the reasons for this, or do we know the reasons? Well, this is contested, of course. China will blame what the United States has done. The United States will obviously blame what China. In other words, it's kind of classic Cold War confrontation, Cold War blaming of the other side and holding the other side responsible. I don't like the word Cold War, by the way, but I only use it here for shorthand. Why the reasons? Well, pick whatever you want to pick. It's what's going on in Hong Kong. It's what's going on in China, Taiwan. It's what's happening in Xinjiang. It's what's been happening in the South China Seas. You know, it's a whole bunch of areas. It's about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's about China's technological challenge to America. It's about COVID. And that, of course, has played in to the deterioration. But COVID has only added one more deep, malignant factor into the relation. I think more fundamentally, I take it back to power. As Cherry and I used to teach in Bedar, it's about power in the end. It's about power transitions. There's a power shift many people believe is happening, and I think that is the ultimate driver of the relationship. And there is this perception, obviously not entirely unreal, not entirely untrue. Whether one believes America's in decline, and I think many Chinese believe that, I think probably incorrectly, there's certainly a perception that China is rising. Now, very, very quickly, just to end my own thing, the Trump factor has been important, but I don't think it's been overwhelmingly determinant. I think it's crucial. I would add it into any mix of analysis, and again, I want to hear what our American colleagues have to say. You know, he's made attacks on China a central part of his own grand strategy. The long-term anti-China strategy is there. And as you can see, even when he got elected in 2016, he had a clear anti-China perspective. And of course, we've seen that in the so-called trade wars and many, many other things. So I think it's deeply embedded within the Trump, but I don't again think it's Trump alone. I think there's something more fundamental going on. Where does that leave us in terms of the election? Well, I think it means that if Trump gets elected, and I'll leave that up for others to think about, then I think we're going to see more of the same and possibly worse. If Biden gets election, we certainly are going to see some changes in American foreign policy. If Biden gets election in terms of multilateralism, in relations with the European Union, multilateralism, the whole question of climate change is going to be addressed much more differently, much better relations with the EU. But I'll leave you with a question: will it lead to a fundamental change and improvement in the relation with China? At the moment, my answer to that is probably not, and almost certainly no. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mick. I think that sets the scene quite well. And now, Professor Kroenig, Mick just touched on what we might see from a Trump presidency, but what have we learned from the last 4 years, and what can we expect if there are another 4 coming?
Great. Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to be here, for LSE for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to speak with my distinguished colleagues, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. I share the pessimism of Professor Cox, and he said the Americans will probably blame the Chinese, so I'll go ahead and do that. Because I think the United States, there was this consensus after the end of the Cold War that we would engage China, bring it into the WTO. As China became richer and enmeshed in the global system, it would liberalize its policies. It would become a responsible stakeholder in the rules-based system. And that was really the U.S. approach. And then I think what we've seen is that hasn't worked, that as China has grown richer, instead of becoming more cooperative, it's becoming more assertive, especially under President Xi. And so we see China preying on the global economic system with its unfair trade practices. We see it becoming more aggressive militarily in its border dispute with India and in the South China Sea. Its human rights practices. President Xi has set himself up to be the most powerful dictator in China since Mao Zedong, engaging in ethnic cleansing in Xinjiang. And so I think this behavior has then changed the view in Washington. I think there is a bipartisan consensus now that old strategy didn't work and we need a new approach. And so I think the Trump administration deserves credit for identifying great power competition with Russia and China as the foremost challenge to U.S. national security. If you look at the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy, 2018 National Defense Strategy, it identifies this as the top priority. And I think maybe some people watching at a distance or paying attention to just the headlines might think, well, how real is this? President Trump, praises President Xi sometimes. This trade war, doesn't seem to be fully thought through. If you look at what the bureaucracies are doing, it's really remarkable, I think, how much they've reoriented to the China challenge. It's very clearly the top priority of the Department of Defense, the most remarkable transition of the Pentagon I've seen since the transition to the war on terror. State Department, Secretary Pompeo making this a foremost priority. The FBI greatly stepping up counterintelligence operations against Chinese influence in the United States. So there has been a major shift. And it would have been easy for President Trump to continue the kind of previous policy. A lot of American businessmen were getting rich in China. But I think it was the right move to take this tougher approach. Great power competition is not a strategy, and that was one of the criticisms of the 2017 national security strategy. But I think the administration has made some progress on elaborating what they're trying to do. In May, the White House released a new China strategy, and it had two major elements. First, it said it's about we need to strengthen ourselves and strengthen our alliances for this new, more competitive era. And I think that's right. If you think about competition in athletics or anywhere else, it's not so much about hurting your enemy, it's more about strengthening yourself. So investing in new technology, strengthening U.S. alliances to prepare for this, especially in Asia. I think we've seen that with the formation of this Quad organization to deal with China. And then the second pillar of the strategy was to impose cost on the Chinese Communist Party, where it is violating widely held international standards in the military, economic, and governance domain. So I think overall that works. Looking ahead to a second term, I've talked to senior Trump administration foreign policy officials who've said that China will remain the ~1 priority. They've said Iran will be the ~2 priority, which is kind of interesting, a whole nother conversation for another time. But China will remain the priority. And so what would I hope to see in a second term Trump administration? One, I think defining the goals a little bit more clearly would be helpful. And Professor Cox mentioned H.R. McMaster's book. And in that book, H.R. McMaster says the goal should be to change the minds of Chinese leaders. And I think that's right. The goal is not endless competition. The goal is not to fight World War III. The goal is not, in my view, regime change of the CCP. But I think it's to change the people around President Xi's mind or the next generation of Chinese leaders, that this new confrontational approach that they're on isn't going to work, that challenging the United States and its allies and the rules-based system is too difficult, and they're better off going back to a more cooperative approach. I'd also like to see the Trump administration engage allies a little bit more. I think the free world is coming around to this threat. A lot of evidence of this, but just I think it was yesterday, Sweden joined the democratic countries that are banning Huawei and ZTE 5G technology in their countries. And so I think, if it's the United States against China, it's a little bit too close for comfort. We're 23% of GDP, real GDP. China is about 15%. But if it's U.S. and formal treaty allies, we're 59% of global GDP against China's 13%. So clearly in a much stronger position if we can present a unified front with our allies in Europe and in Asia. And I'd also like to see a little bit more of an engagement element, even though I think we're right to lean on this more competitive approach. I do think there are areas that we do want to continue engagement with China on environmental issues, on arms control, food security, and other areas. And I wouldn't want to see the baby thrown out with the bathwater. I do have a couple of responses to some things Professor Cox said about power versus the ideology in the competition and whether the U.S. is declining. But I think I've exhausted my time, so I'll maybe pause here and we can pick that up in the discussion.
Thank you very much. I think that gives a very good idea of what we could expect looking forward. So broad alliances and working with allies, that's something which Joe Biden has stressed quite a lot in his reflections of how he would approach China. So Dr. Medeiros, what could we expect from Team Biden if he wins the election on the 3rd or shortly afterwards?
Well, I think we can expect a lot. And I think it'll be very new and it'll be very refreshing. But I'd like to begin by thanking you for inviting me here. I'm a graduate of the LSE. I did my PhD graduating in 2002 before LSE Ideas even existed. So it's always a pleasure for me to be back here. And I'm hoping that my LSE education will sort of reinforce to you, you won't get a completely, totally biased American perspective, though, of course, as a former senior US official, I sort of do have that as part of my DNA. But I enjoyed my time at LSE enormously, and always bring those experiences with me to events like this. So what's Joe Biden going to do on China? And I think that Professor Cox and Professor Kroenig did a very nice job sort of summarizing where we are today. Though I would say that Professor Kroenig did a fantastic job of putting lipstick on a very, very ugly pig. Trump's China policy, if it's been marked by anything, it's been marked by almost total incoherence, doing and saying multiple different things at different times. And while I think that Matt is right, that Trump, the Trump administration is due credit for changing the American conversation about China, calling a spade, characterizing the US-China relationship as strategic competition, talking about reorienting American resources, especially Defense Department resources, to strategic competition. That absolutely was a good thing. We can debate about whether or not the Trump administration has actually implemented that approach, but nonetheless, changing the conversation in the United States was a good thing. I think their weakness has been their inability to actually execute on that. And their competition has really been much more about confrontation. And, if you were to ask anybody, where is Trump actually taking us with China? Where is the US-China relationship going under President Trump? I think, it's unclear what the answer is. And to the extent that one could answer it, it looks like it's toward a pathway toward endless confrontation and conflict. And so the Democrats simply have a different view. And it's a view that embraces strategic competition as the frame for the US-China relationship. And it's a competition that operates on at least 4 different levels: competition on security, competition on economics, which are not new or surprising. Those features have existed for a long time. But there's also competition on technology, and there's competition on ideology. And I think that there's a widely held recognition that that's just simply the state of affairs. But the question is, what do you do in that context? And if you were to boil down Vice President Biden's strategy, it's about making sure that America runs faster, not just that we focus on slowing the other guy down, which I think has largely been the Trump approach. And that's reflected in 4 different priorities. Number 1, Trump's priority on investing at home. Political revitalization, economic revitalization that begins with solving COVID, right? As a professor at a prestigious American university living in Washington, D.C., I still haven't been tested for COVID. I don't have access to a free test for COVID, right? The United States is just failing its citizens with the lack of access to the kind of medical care necessary to prevent this. So, Biden's China strategy is about revitalizing America at home. And I think you're very likely to see some very, very significant fiscal expenditures and plans to send a message to not just China, but American allies and friends all over the world, in Europe and in Asia, that America understands that for it to be a good ally, for America to compete over the long term, America needs to improve itself, its infrastructure, its education, its spending on R&D, American institutions, right? Rebuilding American institutions. And so fundamentally, competition begins at home. Number 2, it's about rebuilding American credibility abroad. And that's reflected in the Biden strategy of reinvesting in multilateral institutions, rejoining the WHO, revitalizing the WTO, rejoining Paris, rejoining the Iran nuclear deal. And that's based on the reflection that America can do better in a multipolar world when it works with like-minded countries, and often using multilateral organizations as a platform, even though it sometimes means that you have to pull back a little bit on your ultimate goals, that aggregating those capabilities and those efforts is more beneficial over the long term. A second expression of that is doing more with allies. And while that also has been a Trump priority, I think the Trump administration has basically been a disaster when it comes to allies, right? European allies feel very alienated by the consistent criticism and coercive actions taken against Europe, and even in Asia. And while our close allies in Japan and Korea do a pretty good job of keeping a stiff upper lip, sort of below the waterline, what you hear is an incredible amount of frustration and anxiety that Trump is trying to blackmail them into significantly increasing their host nation support, not coordinating with them on key regional security goals or strategies related to, North Korea or China, pushing them to do more on China than they want to do. Japan, very notably has not signed up to the Clean Network initiative. So I think there's a lot of frustration and anxiety within Asia, right? Look no further than TPP. Trump withdraws from TPP, and what does Asia decide? Well, we're going to have to take our future into our own hands, and they go forward with TPP. So you have more investment and serious investment in home. You have revitalizing American alliances. You have working in a more serious and consistent way within multilateral organizations. And I think the last piece of it is democracy promotion, not pulling punches on the ideological differences between the United States and China, recognizing that China does have some illiberal goals, and it's been very creative and in some instances effective at advancing those illiberal strategies. China has even been able to maneuver within multilateral organizations to advance some of its foreign policy priorities in an illiberal way. The U.S. withdrawal from the Human Rights Commission is a case in point. U.S. withdrawal, China steps forward. So I think working with democracies, sort of generating a shared vision for what liberal institutions and a liberal order looks like, trying to rebuild the credibility of a rules-based order, I think is going to be a fourth pillar of what Biden's going to do. And look, this is the theory, it's not the practice. Actually executing on all four of these is going to be very hard, but I think at least it starts with a recognition that American interests are advanced in all of these areas. And when you have, examples of Trump telling the Chinese he doesn't care about Xinjiang, he doesn't care about Hong Kong, that undermines, all of the traditional strengths of the U.S. approach to the world, and it undermines the credibility of his China strategy. So I know that Matt's not here to sort of, be a proxy for the Trump campaign, but my point is simply that there is a stark contrast between the China strategy of Trump, both what he said he would do and what he actually did, but more importantly, between what he did and the vision that Biden and the Democrats have laid out. And it will be difficult and hard to implement, but I think that those four pillars that I outlined are a smart and serious way to begin. So full stop there, and I welcome discussion with my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very comprehensive overview of what we might expect if we do see Biden win on the 3rd. But let's turn now to Dr. Yu Jie. So we've heard a lot there, and it seems like for both candidates, there are pros and cons in terms of China's strategic priorities abroad. So how could we expect China's foreign policy to evolve faced with either candidate? And what should we be looking out for?
Well, Gideon, I'm not doing multiple choice question tonight, I hope. Anyway, I'm delighted to return to LSE and LSE Ideas, my truly intellectual home. And I noticed there seems to be a little bit LSE guns here tonight, apart from several other speakers. I'm also among those graduates here and learned so much about international affairs. So I consider here to just return, feel really at ease at home. So thanks again for my colleagues from LSE Ideas to put up this starry panel together. Now, view from Beijing, very difficult to answer at the moment. But what all I'm saying in here today is not based on gossip. It's not based on what I've heard in the power corridor of Beijing, because I have absolutely no access as such at all. All I'm saying from here today is based on all the official media and also the press release has been done by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All my understanding is, even at this stage, that Trump administration adding all tensions at all fronts towards China. It has been quite clear for some time that Beijing doesn't intend to make relations with the United States spin out of control. It's walking a very tight rope. I mean, presidency walking a very tight rope to respond, so it could really not be seen weak at home, but continuously to negotiate with the United States. And President Xi Jinping and other senior officials has been really conspicuously so far absent from making any direct public comments on Washington's provocative moves or whoever the favorite candidates by the Chinese authority. So, obviously the principles of non-interference principle, China does not interfere in domestic affairs of another country, would continue in here, even with the US presidential election. And mostly leaving the foreign ministry in Beijing and also the official media to fight back against whatever the provocative rhetorics from Trump's administration. Now, in the mindset of the Chinese leaders, they consider Washington is clearly triggering the Chinese officials to behave irrationally, so that bilateral ties can be allowed to continue to plunge for the sake of helping President Trump for his presidential election victory next month. But however, I don't think it's really in Beijing's interest to be in a situation of China vis-a-vis a united front of so-called democracy or united front of democracy in the West against China, both economically and politically. So if you ask me which candidate they are very much in favor, I don't think either candidate will do China any favor at this moment, judging by all the policy agendas Matthew and Evan has been listed so far. Now, over the summer, we heard that a group of policy hawks led by Secretary Michael Pompeo in Trump's administration have gone any length to try to destabilize and isolate China in order to achieve their long-term goal of suppressing China's rise. And obviously, Secretary Pompeo believed that the party does not represent the Chinese people. Therefore, they want to separate the party and the Chinese people and to liberate the Chinese people. So perhaps his idea derived from his 1989 experience, where there was actually a genuine gap between the Eastern European people and vis-a-vis the ruling communist parties. But actually, he failed to recognize the extremely strong support of the Chinese Communist Party received from the Chinese society. Mick earlier was talking about opinion polls in the United States, talking about public opinion towards China has gone down quite significantly. But on the other hand, if I may, could also cite the opinion polls data being collected by University of San Diego, California, and suggested that asking average urban Chinese citizens whether they would like to live in an under political system like in China, or they prefer to live in other political system. Now the answer in 2019 was 70%, but now the answer by June this year is 88%. So obviously that shows the Chinese handling of the coronavirus seems to regain the confidence of the Chinese people towards the party. But of course, the initial mishandling China is not to be excused. Now, equally important, I mean, if we're talking about engagement strategy in the past 4 years, the United States has really created a reasonable pro-America mentality within the Chinese central government departments, but also among well-traveled Chinese middle class. And previously, Chinese leaders maybe perhaps denounced the US values or system, but they did not really prevent of sending their children to study in the American colleges. Up until 2019, China remained as the largest source of international students in the United States. So if we're talking about a disengagement policy, that's actually risk alienating liberal-minded Chinese elites who could be perhaps more important potential allies within the United States in terms of United States competition with China. So to make matter even worse, rather than inducing change favored by the United States, inducing change inside China, really, if we're talking about is disengagement policy as what President Trump has proposed, will perhaps only drive 1.4 billion population people to live in angry isolation, a scenario that President Richard Nixon wanted to avoid by all means in the late 1960s. So obviously, Trump's victory would be dreadful for China and for Sino-US relations, but perhaps something a political present or political gift for President Xi Jinping. So the more United States demonizing China, the more Chinese citizens, even those who dislike President Xi's leadership, would rally behind him and within the party. So anyone who actually wants to criticize Xi Jinping's dealing towards the United States would be actually accused of kowtowing to the foreign aggressors. So politically, perhaps a Trump victory will be an advantage for President Xi. Now, some other observers in Asia and elsewhere hoping that victory by Biden in November would actually return a far more calm era in which Washington and Beijing putting aside the difference on security, on trade, on human rights, and to expand commerce and cooperate on global governance challenges. Well, that would be a very rosy picture in here. So on Biden victory, I think would be less dramatic, will seem less dramatic the rhetoric towards China, but really consistent tough action against the Chinese industrial and foreign policy will no doubt be remain on the table. And perhaps on a slightly positive spectrum, on a slightly positive note, perhaps America's commitment of defending liberal international order once restored, the Chinese leader perhaps would be aware that restraint is bid for the international leadership. And if Biden's agenda was to realize, the United States would be feel more secure and perhaps less paranoid about China's rise. But however, I don't think we can be sure that this is the only direction to travel for various reasons. I mean, there used to be hope that China's economy and China's economic system would converge that of the advanced industrial economies. But within Beijing's turn into more state-led economy even further, and such expectation would have to perhaps evaporated. And also in the Western political establishments in here, President Xi's ideas of the famous new forms of great power relations or any sorts of United States and China coexistence has so far failed to gain much currency and popularity. And by the way, that whole notion on new form of great power relations is referred, it was actually initiated by a LSE graduate as well, back to 1973. Now, these are obviously been really widespread support in the United States and also around the world, as what Evan said, a less dramatic but targeted approach and advocated by many political figures from Berlin, Brussels, Tokyo, and Washington, that United States should be willing to use targeted restriction and sanctions discreetly on those thorny issues and perhaps on technology and on human rights, but more generally develop a more policy that dealing with China's peaceful coexistence with the United States and with the allies through multilateral institutions. So obviously it sounds like a very much a balanced approach to me, but how China would take it, we're not sure so far. So what we have seen so far is that Beijing put forward this strategy, the economic strategy of so-called dual circulation, by relying on domestic production and domestic consumption to drive its own economy. It seems to work very well so far. And the part of that dual circulation strategy, it is not response of China's fragile economic recovery, but actually a direct response for a far less accommodating international environment. But obviously, overall, this coronavirus has only exacerbated the political, technological, and ideological divisions between the United States and China. So the worst public health crises have not in generation have really failed to yield any slightest element of constructive cooperation between Beijing and Washington. This is perhaps a really sad moment for the international affairs. I mean, my suggestion to go forward would be start with 3R. Let's not seeking revenge, either United States or revenge China, because again, as I said, we do not want to see the angry isolation of that billions of population. And also let's not repeat the chaos and erratic tactics made by President Trump, but instead, let's have a calm reset on the bilateral relations between Beijing and Washington. I ended in here. I know there are many disagreements with me, but I'm happy to take your questions and comments.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I think a lot of those unknowns will be answered very soon, or at least we'll see some early signs. I think I'll move directly into Q&A because I've seen we have a lot of questions, but not much time. So maybe I'll pose 2 questions at once, and then I'll let you answer those if that's okay. So we have one here from Ekaterina Dimitrova, and please do forgive me for any mispronunciations throughout. And I think this would be quite good for Evan and Matthew. Specifically, Ekaterina asks, will a potential Trump re-election lead to irreparable damage for transatlantic relations? And maybe will a Biden administration fix some of the cool rhetoric we've seen over the last 4 years? And also one which I think, Matthew, perhaps you'd want to answer, but also Mick, from Christina Chatzitheodoru. Would it be possible for a second Trump administration to pull a Nixon and Kissinger and improve relations with Russia against China? So playing the China card against the Soviet Union back then. Perhaps, Yujia, you might want to jump into that as well. I don't think China would allow something like that to happen and has invested a lot into improving and strengthening relations with Russia. But okay. I'll let you answer.
Why don't we go in order just quickly? On the transatlantic, I'm bound to say, and it's not directed against Matthew or for Evan by definition, but I can't see the relationship getting anything but better on the transatlantic side. I mean, it's been a very, very tough 4 years in that relationship, not allocating blame either side of that relationship. President Trump's support for Brexit is hardly a vote for the European Union. You know, his views on NATO earlier expressed, although not followed through, and I do appreciate the difference between rhetoric and reality. But nonetheless, I mean, there's no question. And part of the improvement I hope will take place is that President Trump, rightly or wrongly, is terribly unpopular in most countries in Europe. Not in all, not in Hungary, not in Poland. So I'd like to see a much more improvement in the soft power part of the relationship on this side of the Atlantic as well. On the Nixon move, I don't think so. I mean, again, we're not talking about Russia, but Russia is obviously part of the discussion about great power relations, as both Matthew and Evan said. But the truth of the matter is that was the Cold War. And that new relationship grew up in the context of the Cold War. I cannot see that returning A, Cold War, and B, of course, relations with Russia are actually just as difficult for the United States, maybe even more so for the US with Russia itself. And I think, again, any big move towards Russia now by whichever person who wins is going to be hugely problematic within the United States. So could I also say just one very final thing? It's actually fantastic for LSE to have constantly renew its relationship with our American friends. We always boast how many great Americans have studied, from John F. Kennedy, Senator Moynihan, David Rockefeller. We've even had 2 Fed chairs, John Tower, and by the way, Chief Justice Anthony Kennedy. Like Evan, they all benefited from an LSE education. So again, it's wonderful to have this kind of dialogue with our American friends.
Thank you. Why don't we go with Matthew? Do you want to come in on that then, Evan and Yujia?
And that is a big gap in my resume. I never had the privilege of studying at LSE, but honored to be invited here today. I'll begin with the reverse Kissinger idea that the US should align with Russia against China. That's something I write about in my new book on great power rivalry, and I have a piece in Foreign Policy recently that I published in the chat. But I also don't think that makes very much sense. I'm skeptical that Russia and China will be able to form a deep partnership in the first place. I think there are a lot of reasons for rivalry between Russia and China. Two, I don't think Putin wants to help the United States in our foremost challenge of the 21st century. I don't see why he would agree to that strategy. Three, I don't know why we would believe him if he said he was going to help us with this. We don't believe him to uphold peace agreements in Crimea or to not violate the INF Treaty. So I don't think we'd believe him. And then finally, I don't think Russia really brings much to the table. It's less than 2% of global GDP. I'd much rather cooperate with Germany and Japan against China than Russia. On transatlantic relations, I think this is a tough time for transatlantic relations. We have faced tough times in the past, though. Vietnam, the Iraq War, Suez crisis. So I think we can recover. Just briefly, I wanted to pick up something that Professor Cox said in the introduction about, is this about power or is this about ideology? And I think it's about both. And I think the ideology affects the hard power aspects in a way. I think the fact that China is run by the Chinese Communist Party does mean that it has certain strengths, but also certain weaknesses that could be exploited in a competitive strategy. I mean, just one example, China spends more on internal security than it does on its military. The United States is 2-to-1 in the other direction. And so, you know, autocratic countries are worried about domestic stability, about repressing their population. And so I think that's a weakness that the Chinese Communist Party has in this competition that maybe a democratic China wouldn't. So I think it's about both ideology and power. Quickly on it, is the United States declining? If you look at US GDP numbers, we've been at about between 20 and 25% of global GDP since the 1960s. According to the most recent data I saw, we were at 22 or 23%. So I don't think it's that the United States is declining. I think it's more that China has been rising, so it's a relative decline. So the real question is, does China continue this ascent or not? And I think we're seeing that their growth numbers are really slowing. I think we're seeing diplomatically that countries are counterbalancing against China in a way that they haven't before. So I wonder whether China can actually continue this.
If I could just jump in there very, very quickly, Matthew, I don't want to take up any. I don't actually think it is in decline. I've been one of the academics at the LSE has been arguing against this notion of American decline for about 20 years. My main point, my more accurate point, I hope, is actually Chinese perceptions that America is in decline. And I think that is a perception. And I think that's a very dangerous perception, because that can lead to, I think, some very wrong problems. As we know, perceptions, as we all know from studying Robert Jervis and many others, can make a huge difference to the way people take policies and sometimes can miscalculate. That was my main point, but I'm glad you raised that anyway.
And thanks for clarifying. I think you're right that China does perceive a U.S. decline, whether real or not. But those were my only points. So thank you.
Thanks. Great.
So why don't I come in here, and I'd like to make 3 points. First, on this issue of perceptions and misperceptions, I agree with Matthew and Professor Cox that there's no question that the Chinese believe the U.S. is in relative decline, and they increasingly look at it in ideological terms. One of the key advisors around Xi Jinping, Kroenig, is somebody that studied in the United States. He wrote this very well-known book where he basically said America is full of a series of internal contradictions. Now, of course, the mismanagement of COVID just, reinforces those Chinese perceptions. But here's the thing: in the history of the U.S.-China relationship, the Chinese have had these debates about the United States' relative position on and off for years. And they've been wrong in every instance in the past, and they're probably going to be wrong again. And the simple reason is they continue to make the same mistake. They simply discount the degree to which America's political system and economy are resilient. So Matthew's point about GDP, share of global GDP. But they also fundamentally don't understand the way our political system engenders revitalization, right? It's a very nonlinear process in the United States. So in other words, if the trajectory of America is an upward trajectory, it's not necessarily a linear one, right? There's dips and inclines, etc. And the Chinese just have made this mistake before, and they're making that same mistake again. And I think right now that their ability to recognize they're making that mistake is significantly encumbered by the ideological lenses that Xi Jinping have imposed on that system. There's so little debate and discussion internally now. There's a political environment that doesn't allow the kind of questioning to say, hey, did we get the United States wrong again? And so I worry that that misperception may have greater legs than it did in the past and lead to some risky and inaccurate decision-making on the part of China. Second point, very briefly, is about this China-Russia question. And the reason I want to come in on the reverse Kissinger is I think it's important to point out to your listeners that something very interesting is going on in the US-Russia-China triangle, which is we're at this very unique period where China-Russia relations and Russia-China relations are stronger than each of those countries' relations with Washington, right? So that part of those legs of the triangle are longer than they've ever been. And both Xi and Putin use each other more as a reference point for their own foreign and defense policy than they do the United States. So as Matthew, I thought, very articulately laid out, the prospect of a reverse Kissinger doesn't remotely make sense. And simply put, neither Beijing nor Washington are interested in it. I think that ultimately is going to, be seen as a poor decision on China's part. But, nonetheless, I think it is what it is. And so to sort of, get to the third issue, which is transatlantic relations, I'm not, it's not an area that I'm a particular expert in, but there is an important China dimension to it, right? As Biden thinks about revitalizing and rethinking U.S. strategy with Europe, I think one of the new and interesting dimensions of it in the conversations that I've had with European colleagues in the last few, I would say 18 to 24 months, is that there is a broad convergence in American and European perceptions of the nature of the China challenge, seeing it in security terms, in economic terms, technology terms, and interestingly, and especially ideological terms, whether it's the Northern European states in Scandinavia, Germany in the heart of Europe. There is actually, because of Europe's experience with the Cold War, in my assessment, among elites, it's much easier for them to see the U.S.-China contest or the China challenge in ideological terms as well as in power terms. So I see there's a broad convergence on China, which may create a new pillar of transatlantic cooperation that didn't happen before. Now, I think the challenge is going to be, how do you move from common perceptions of the China challenge to coordinated strategies? And I think there's a real gap there, because I think that there's far less willingness to assume the kind of costs, risk, and friction associated with American strategies within Europe. I think there's just, in part, it's sort of diplomatic statecraft in disposition, and I think it's in part a fear of dependence or over-dependence on China. So I think that there's a lot of work the United States is going to have to do, and to build up that pillar of transatlantic cooperation. But it's absolutely an opportunity there. And my sense is, political elites, diplomats, journalists, academics in Europe are really are open to creating China as a new dimension of the transatlantic alliance. Full stop there.
Thank you. Yujia, I don't know if you want to come in on any of those points.
Sure. Let me start with the Sino-Russian relations one. Obviously, the answer is no. The reason why I'm saying this, I think the Sino-Russian relations is now actually at its best stage, as good as you can get, because each country has a different outlook internationally. I mean, China's clearly eyes on global leadership, while Russia just wants to show itself, still become itself, make it relevant. And China clearly integrate itself into the world economy, and therefore make sure it is a friends or enemies, and has to be within China as economic partners. But on the other hand, while Russia has a completely different way of pursuing its prestige and pursuing its power, which is by very traditional geographical and geopolitical play games, and what they have made so far in the MENA region, in Middle East, for example, or for example, in Ukraine. So I think those two countries have a very different outlook internationally. And secondly, if we're talking about any strategic partnership between China and Russia, I'm afraid it doesn't exist. Partially it's because what China really wants, and China wants to have a vibrant international, widely circulated international currency, and China wants to play a big role on the global climate change agenda. And none of those elements, Russia be able to help China. So what I'm seeing so far is rhetorically, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin respected each other a lot, but overall, this partnership only largely exist in style over substance. And also, on the other hand, look at the history in the past, back to 1959, during the 1950s and 1960s. I don't really think Russia would be interested in become, again, the junior partner of China, because in the past, China was the junior partner of Soviet Union back to the 50s and 60s. So I think on Sino-Russia question, I don't think that Kissinger scenario might happen between United States and Russia, and therefore leading towards China, because Russia, by all means, is a secondary power, which is very different from United States and China at this stage. Now, on the question on China misread United States, I largely agree with Evan in here. And I think part of the reason the mistakes that Chinese leadership or the Chinese government has been made so far, it is very much based on the understanding of that particular part of America, that is reading New York Times and study at Harvard and have a job at Wall Street. But they largely really ignore what do people in the Midwest in the United States really think about China. I think that's a part of the misunderstanding, because so far we have created the entire cohort of Chinese elites studying in the United States and know that particular system, but it doesn't know how the institution works and how the political campaign works in the United States. So I think that's part of the reason why China misread it. And secondly, that's also compounded by this whole idea, this whole debate and discussion inside China. I mean, things on diplomacy. Now, it seems to me, for me, that the Chinese leadership now is sending a very confusing signal. On the one hand, yes, we are open for financial opening. We are hoping that market economy would thriving. But then on the other hand, having this war for diplomacy around the world, which really damaged China's international reputation very seriously. And those two signals didn't really go together at all. For me, it's almost like, okay, yes, diplomats saying one thing, and the economist or the economic leadership in China saying another thing. And they constantly have this mixed messages being sending to the rest of the world. I don't really think that Beijing has now formulating a coherent strategy to how to behave itself internationally.
Perfect. Now, we are running short on time, but because they've joined us today and given us so much of their time, I do want to maybe pose one more quick question to Matthew and Evan, and then give the closing words to all the panelists, if that's all right. So very quickly, we've got a question here from George Magnus, who's a good friend of LSE Ideas. And specifically, it's about China's attempts to reframe global institutions and decouple itself. How should and how will both candidates go about countering these efforts? And then if anyone else wants to come in after that.
Do you mean countering which efforts? Decoupling?
Countering efforts to reframe global institutions.
I see.
Do you want to start then, maybe Evan, and then Matthew, and then?
Yeah, so I think the first thing the United States needs to do is get back in the game, right? The reason why China has been able to step forward and start to reframe institutions, the Human Rights Commission, the WHO, the WTO, is simply because America has not only been absent, but it's absent and then hostile toward these institutions. So it's much easier for China to frame these institutions around a different set of values than those from which it was created. And so American re-entry into them, but re-entry is just the table stakes, right? It only gets you so far. The United States is going to have to appreciate as it re-enters that a lot of water there's been a lot of water under the bridge. A lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of skepticism of the United States. And as a result, the US is going to have to be very careful the US is just going to have to be very smart and strategic about how it participates in these institutions. The other part of the US strategy is where the Chinese are violating their commitments in institutions. The US, in concert with like-minded countries, including allies and partners, are going to have to, I think, be very open about this and sort of call the Chinese on their behavior. And whether that involves China's efforts to try and get language about the Belt and Road into UN General Assembly documents or other Chinese initiatives, I think it's going to be very important for the US and like-minded countries to be willing to accept the kind of friction that comes with calling out China for this kind of anti-liberal behavior. So full stop there from me.
So just briefly, I largely agree with Evan, and I think this is a fair criticism of the Trump administration that they haven't used multilateral institutions as well as they could have. I mean, this is our system. We and our allies built it. It works for us, and I think we do need to reassert U.S. influence within the existing institutions. But then the second point I would make is it's not 1945 anymore. It's not 1991 anymore. The world has changed. And I think we also need to revitalize and adapt this system for a new era. And I think there are some exciting ideas out there. One maybe area of consensus, Biden's talked about a summit of democracies. Pompeo in a speech this summer talked about a new alliance of democracies. So I think there is some possibility there. Also, I know the UK is going to be chairing the G7 next year, and apparently in your integrated review, one of the ideas being considered is a new D10 that would add to the G7 countries like Australia, South Korea, India, and I think that has a lot of promise as well. So I think we need to revitalize these multilateral institutions for this new era of competition with China.
Perfect, thank you. I've just been told that we are able to run on a little bit longer just because we have got so many questions, but only if everyone is able to. Could I just, is that 4 nods I see there?
Yep, nodding.
Okay, all right, perfect. Brilliant, okay, in that case, I'll do another 2 questions, then we'll see where we're at. I'll try to close at 7:15. Okay. So I've got a question from Jonathan Fenby. In terms of the recent policies of the Chinese leadership, and I think this one's for you, Yujia, do they, in terms of stressing self-reliance and ideology, does this signal an acceptance of a long-term adversarial relationship with China? And then secondly, excuse me, sorry. So in terms of, let me see. Right.
Why don't we go with that question, because that's a big and important one. I think all of us will have views, but I'd welcome you, Jia's start.
Sure. Let's start with that one then. I think very much so. Again, I'm just judging by Xi Jinping's speech. I mean, one of the term, very alarmingly, he used the word protracted. I mean, a protracted word that referring back to 1937 when Chairman Mao wrote the article and talking about China's longer term fight with Japan back to for 8 or 9 years or so. Now, obviously, if Xi Jinping borrowed that term from Mao and clearly indicate that he prepared much longer fight, both ideologically, both technologically, and as well as economically with the United States. So it's pretty much, I think the Chinese leadership made up its mind. Even after we have a Biden presidency, or even after Biden, we might have another calm American president, Sino-US relations cannot be returned like in the past. So things will have to change. I think it's not just because America has changed, but also China has changed itself, become more confident. And also you have very much that sense of angry younger generation, that younger Chinese people no longer really consider America as really a model of governance anymore. So perhaps I think that all the factors combined together, and Xi Jinping somehow tried to gauge the public mood by arguing that, yes, protracted war, that is what we are expecting with the United States.
Could I come in there? It's easy to argue, and thank you very much, Jonathan, good friend of my LSE, Jonathan Fenby, written some great books on China too. I think it's easier to say, and maybe my comments too indicated the kind of pessimism, which is long term. But if you've been there in the 1960s as I was, and looking at the China-US relationship then, 5 years later, Nixon is in China, and there's even an opera about it to prove it really happened. After Tiananmen, who would have, thought that there would be a new period of engagement? So I still feel there are incentives for cooperation. I know it's now unfashionable to say it, but there are still major incentives for cooperation. I think that's how we got to think as IR scholars. There are economic incentives. There are climate change incentives. You're not going to get the UN functioning without some level of cooperation with China within it, which also impacts on Russia. Long-term economic growth. We're all going to have to come out of this COVID crisis somehow or another. And it seems to me that this, at the moment, although it's alienating China and the United States more, it could well be create incentives for further cooperation. And maybe one other final point I'd make, more general point. Can we get back to Henry Kissinger? Not because I think there's going to be a new kind of major détente in the sense of Kissinger, but let's get back to some strategic thinking. He wrote a book called Strategy. And in essence, what he's saying is, all relations between states are going to be competitive if you're a realist, okay? We kind of get that. Goes back to Thucydides and onwards and upwards. So let's not be surprised by competition, particularly between two great powers with aspirations and with much history between them. On the other hand, you can't have a strategic relationship just based on punishment. It seems to be you've also got to have a strategic relationship based on incentives for cooperation. And I think without getting into the whole question of whether Trump's got it right or wrong, and some of the things that Matthew said, I would partially go along with, not completely. There are no incentives then in Trump's current strategy for coming back in. All there are disincentives for coming back in. So can we get back to some genuine, serious American grand strategy? Please.
So can I come in here, and then I'd welcome Matt's thoughts. So, Michael, I think about this issue a lot. And, the practical reality is where we are in the U.S.-China relationship is there's clearly areas for cooperation. But the question really is not can we cooperate, but what is the practical effect of that cooperation on the broader relationship? And my concern is, sure, we can cooperate on climate change, we can cooperate on COVID. But as somebody that spent 6 years in the White House doing this, cooperation with China is really hard. It takes a lot of time. The Chinese make you pay for it 3-4 times over. And then ultimately what you get from them is about a quarter of what they promised. So cooperation is hard. It's frustrating. And then there are so many, incentives for competition. I talked about security, economics, technology, etc. And then when you put an ideological layer over it, it sort of colors the degree to which cooperation is meaningful. So I think the question is less about can we cooperate, because we can, but whether or not cooperation will have a meaningful impact on the incentives to compete, and especially whether or not that competition has a sort of has a more confrontational and hostile element to it. And all it's going to take is one crisis in the U.S.-China relationship, and we're sort of off to the races. Suddenly, climate change cooperation is going to look interesting and incidental to the broader competition in the relationship. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind. Now, perhaps there'll be a sea change in China's approach, and they'll recognize that they really have to up their game in terms of the quality of their cooperation. But I have to admit, I'm pretty skeptical. What I see is a relationship where the drivers of competition are broadening, expanding, and increasing. The traditional buffers and stabilizers in the relationship, like working on shared threats, are declining pretty rapidly. And so I agree with the thrust of your argument, but sort of operationalizing it feels pretty hard. And that's even separate from the politics. I didn't even talk about sort of the domestic politics of that. But Matt, I'd love to get your views on this question.
Well, I think I agree with much of what my colleagues have said. I think there is the difference between the kind of tactical cooperation on specific issues, non-proliferation, climate, and then the bigger kind of strategic direction of the relationship. And can we imagine at some point the United States and China really having a more cooperative relationship overall, kind of incorporating China into a responsible stakeholder in the rules-based system, the kind of goal in the 90s and the 2000s. And I think that still should be the long-term objective. I think this kind of rules-based system has worked. And if we really want it to flourish, having the second largest economy and military as part of that system would be beneficial. I guess I just see it as very hard under President Xi. It seems like he's decided that this more confrontational approach does make sense. And given that he's eliminated the term limits, he may be in power for quite a long time. So I guess I'm afraid that this is at least a generational competition. It seems like it's going to require the next generation of leaders after President Xi to decide what direction they want to take China. And it's possible that they would take a more confrontational direction too, of course. But I guess, and Evans and Yujie are the real experts on Chinese thinking, but could President Xi change his mind and decide this isn't working? I'm going to try for a more cooperative approach. It's hard for me to imagine that. So I think we're in this for many years.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very good place to wind things up. And we've ventured into a very interesting dimension of the US-China relationship in the longer term. So first of all, I want to say thank you very much to all of our panelists today. It's been absolutely fascinating. And it could be that if certain swing states are called on the 3rd of November, that we might know the which of these possible futures which have been laid out tonight we might see. So thank you very much for providing some insight on that. I would ask the audience to clap at this point, but I can't. So just some final words. There are lots of questions in the Q&A which haven't been answered. LSE Ideas has an extensive events program, and I can see already some on the Asia Pacific. Do check out our events program. You might see your questions answered in a future event. We've strayed into talk about ideology and the longer term relationship of the US and China. And this will be addressed in another event next Thursday on the 28th of October, tackling whether we're entering a Cold War or how we should characterize US-China competition. So I encourage every audience member to turn up for that. Check out our new blog. It's called China Dialogues. And if you just search China Dialogues LSE, you'll be able to find lots of pieces by the experts in our network on many of the questions which have been asked. And yes, that's all from me. You'll receive feedback forms after this event, so please do fill those out. It really helps us optimize our future events. And I'll close this panel one last time by thanking our speakers. You've been absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Evan. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.